friends, welcome back to the channel. I am inside the house today. I've got some food on the stove that I'm keeping an eye on loosely. The mower is out going outside, so it's kind of loud out there. So we're in the house today. I think it's been a little while since we've made a video inside, but I don't know how much of my face you're going to be seeing while I'm talking. I've got a lot of footage that I've taken outside over the past few weeks as I've been propagating, processing Chickasaw plum seed. And I want to talk about how I do that, how I grow Chickasaw plums from seed. We've got Willow here keeping us company. Like I said, I'm focused in this video on propagating Chickasaw plum specifically from seed, but what I'm going to talk about with Chickasaw plum for the most part is applicable to other stone fruit plants, right? So stone fruits, if you're not familiar, are typically your peaches, plums, cherries, apricots, those sorts of fruits. They're all related in the prunus family, and they can typically be propagated using the same methods. For the most part, the seed requires similar, or in most cases, like the same treatment in order to get the seed to germinate. Now, you can also propagate, all stone fruit by grafting, and some of them by digging up suckers, right? But I'm not going to talk about grafting in this video because I don't have much experience grafting, so I'm really not the resource space to go to on that. There's lots of great people here on the internet that can tell you about that. Maybe one day we'll get into it and talk more about it. But I have done some amount of digging and transplanting of suckers or runners, and you can check that out in some of our other Chickasaw plum videos. Like we made one earlier in the spring, probably around March. I'll see if I can link it up here in the corner somewhere, where we did go out and dig a bunch of suckers and we transplanted them out into the landscape. We've potted them up. It's something you can do. If you're not familiar with suckers or runners, just real quick, the plant starts as a seed and it sends a root down and a shoot up. Over time, as it establishes in the soil, horizontal roots go out. Chickasaw plums, many other wild plums, got cut off by a timer there, not sure exactly where we're at, but many other plum species, many other plant species outside of plums have this ability where the horizontal roots will occasionally, I don't know what controls this, they'll shoot up new shoots, new stems and leaves. And you can come in, dig up that new stem, cut or terminate where the root was connected to the main plant, propagate that. It's a means of clonally propagating the plant. Again, there's no sexual reproduction happening, there's no seed. You're just vegetatively or clonally propagating the plant. So if you're going to grow Chickasaw plums from seed, or for that matter, any other plums or stone fruit, you need to be concerned about something called double dormancy. You're concerned maybe is not the exact right word. You need to be aware of something called double dormancy and stratification, and just what are the needs of the plum seed in order to get good germination rates. Well, with wild plums, with Chickasaw plums and most other plums, there's a tendency for the seed to go into what's called double dormancy. And double dormancy, what that means is the seed did not receive the treatment that it wanted to receive in order to germinate in spring. And the seed is now going to wait for a long time to germinate. Once it's in that double dormancy, it can be difficult to get the seeds to wake up. They can wake up, they're not dead. They just enter a really deep sleep if they don't get the stratification requirements that they want. When you think about plums, they're going to ripen sometime in the summer and fall to the ground. And I use the parallel of tomatoes for a lot of seed saving stuff. Think about a tomato. When the tomato drops to the ground in the summer, if that seed germinates right away, it's not going to have very much time to grow before the dormant season happens, right? And so the tomato has a dormancy, a sprout inhibitor basically on the seed. That's why when you save tomato seeds, you ferment the seed. It's going to break down that the germination inhibitor on the seed coat and allow the seed to germinate when you plant them. With plums, with Chickasaw plums, it's not a specific compound. There's no specific sprout inhibiting compound on the surface of the seed. So fermenting the seed is not going to increase your germination rates with Chickasaw plum. What the Chickasaw plum wants and needs in order to germinate is stratification. And typically when we think about stratification with tree species, we're thinking about winter stratification, cold stratification. Basically mimicking wintertime conditions, because most of the trees that I propagate anyway, the native trees on the East Coast, a lot of the fruits, the nuts ripen in the fall, they drop to the ground, they need to not sprout in fall because they don't have enough time to grow before winter. They need to sit dormant all throughout the cold and moist period of the year, and then in the spring they wake up. So most of our temperate, tree species, I was going to say nuts, but tree species, most of the seeds requires a cold stratification. For plums, stone fruit, and also for many other fruits and nuts that ripen earlier in the season, they may require a warm stratification followed by a cold stratification. And so that is certainly the case for Chickasaw plums. What they are used to in nature is a warm period. It may be a little bit moist, it may be a little bit dry, moisture might fluctuate, but it's warm. followed by a cold period where there's typically going to be a little bit more moisture, which would be, summer and then winter. And so if you can mimic those conditions for your plum seeds, you will typically get good germination the spring that follows the season that you collected them from. So if you collected the seed in summer, they would germinate that following spring in an ideal world, if you can replicate the conditions correctly. Now, if they don't germinate that following spring, again, it doesn't always mean that they're dead, but they may have entered that double dormancy, and then you've really got to work to try to break the dormancy. So that is the theory behind what's going on. The way that I practically interact with this in the world is that I gather my plums. One of two things is then going to happen. I'm either going to eat the plums fresh or process them in the kitchen with like a food mill or something like that. To set, if I eat them fresh, I can just spit out the seed. If I process them with a food mill, the food mill is going to separate the skins and the seeds from the pits. And so I'm left with, either way, I'm left with pits, plum seeds, pits. And typically, as you may know from eating stone fruit, there's usually a little bit of flesh still surrounding the seed. The seed is not completely clean when it comes out of your mouth or out of the food mill. The other thing that may happen is I may have sometimes I'll gather rotten fruits that I only am gathering for purposes of seed collection and extraction, or I may sometimes gather the fruits and I want to feed them to my animals. I may have gathered so much that I'm not able to eat it, or the fruit is like, kind of towards the end of its life, mushy, not totally bad, but I just would rather feed it to the chickens. So in that situation, I've got to try to figure out how can I get the pit separated from the pulp, because I want to feed the pulp, the skin, the juices to the animals, but I still want to save the seed. Or in the case, if it's really just moldy seed, I don't have to worry about separating the pit at all. Basically, just there's a lot of different ways you can approach separating the pulp and the fruit, what you're going to do with the pulp and the skins. To my mind, the separation part, getting the pulp and the skins separate from the seed, that's pretty straightforward. Once you have a food mill, that's pretty easy to do. And there are other ways to do it. I've experimented around with, for trying to feed animals, trying to mash the fruit up with my hands and in a bucket with a bunch, and then just, putting some water and kind of agitating things around, trying to pour off, this liquid pulp water mixture, and the seeds all will sink to the bottom. This is common seed saving practices that we've talked about before in this channel. That's involved with a lot of wet seed saving. And so plums certainly are a wet type of seed. The seed comes ripe in a wet condition inside of a fruit. So there's definitely some nuances to talk about there, but I feel like that part, the separation part, is pretty straightforward. As always, please let me know if you have questions about that part. But the part that becomes more interesting to my mind, where there's more to talk about, is how clean does the seed need to get? How do you get it clean? And then how do you store it so that it stratifies the way that you want it to stratify? All right, so real quick, I don't have any footage of us using a food mill to process the plums, but that's the tool that most people, I think, are going to use if they're making some sort of preserve, like a jam, out of the pulp from the plums. But what I do want to show is maybe some of you are going to end up like me, where you have a bunch of plums, you kind of leave them in the fridge too long, and they get a little bit too soft to really enjoy, and you want to process a ton of them. In a process, get the seed out, remove it from the skin of the pulp. And you want to do it quickly because you're mostly interested in growing the seeds. Maybe, you don't have a food mill and you're really just interested in processing a ton of seeds. You can use bucket technology like we've talked about before on the channel for doing wet seed saving. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to have to mash up the fruit either by hand or by pouring them into a bucket filled with water, hitting them with a paint mixer perhaps. Can put a lid on the bucket, let the fruit kind of ferment for a few days. That kind of makes it easier to smash up the fruit if you want to. Like I said, it's not going to help germination that the fruit ferments, but it helps get the seeds out of the fruit. So again, bucket technology here. So you've got this whole mash in a bucket or some sort of container. It's got pulp, seeds, skin, everything. You're going to then take that bucket and you're going to want to pour the water off slowly. And remember that the skins are going to float. The pulp is going to kind of go into solution in the water, and the seeds are going to sink. Now, I'd like to use a second bucket to pour the water off into so that I can collect that nutrient-rich water that has the pulp in solution. I like to use a screen to catch all of the skins. I'll put those in the compost or I'll feed them to the chickens. And like I said, all the seeds are going to sink. And so as you pour off that water, you're going to get to a point where you just have seeds in the bottom of the bucket. It can be useful to clean the screen, get the skins off of it, dump all of the seeds from the bottom of the bucket into the screen, rinse them off with some more water, some combination of screens and fresh water and buckets. And this is what I mean by bucket technology, basically. And anyway, I wanted to share this just in case any of you are in a situation where you don't have a food mill, you're not just like eating the seeds and spitting them out. You want another way to process the seeds as quickly as you can. The bucket technology can work. If you just want to plant seeds for your own purposes, for growing trees for yourself, they do not need to be clean at all. They can be slimy and covered in pulp still. I sometimes want to clean seeds further because I distribute a lot of seeds, and for distribution, I want the seed to be at least a little bit cleaner for, for folks that are paying me money for seed. It just makes it makes them easier to count, easier to see what their condition is, and that sort of, it's just a cleaner presentation that I like. I've tried a few things, but the thing that I've landed on for seed cleaning is microbes and worms. And I take either the seeds and skin out of the food mill or the mashed up moldy fruit. I put it in a bucket or some sort of container that has holes drilled in the bottom for drainage. I mix in wood chips and seeds and pulp and skin and all that stuff together, and I let it sit. Let it sit outside in a shady place, but a place where it can get some rainwater, or you can water it. If you're in a drought, you do want to have adequate moisture in there for the microbes to break down and clean the surface of the seed, basically, of all of that pulp. It is important to know rodents of many sorts like to eat plum seeds and other stone fruit seeds, so you need to think about how you're going to protect your seeds from rodents. I typically achieve this with 1/4-inch hardware cloth. Sometimes I use 1/2 inch. They say that mice can sneak through a 1/2 inch hole. I haven't had any issues with mice stealing things out of 1/2 inch hardware cloth yet. 1/2 inch hardware cloth is cheaper and more durable and sturdy than 1/4 inch, so there's a debate between what's really the ideal hardware cloth for this. But hardware cloth is typically what I use to exclude the rodents from any sort of containers where I have plum seed in the process of being cleaned. Now, it's also important to know I'm doing this outside. It's summertime. So I've started the process of stratification just right there by trying to clean the seeds. If you wanted to plant the seeds yourself and you don't care about them getting clean, you could sow the seeds immediately in summer where you want them to grow, whether that be in pots, in a place in the ground, in a garden bed, in a nursery bed, like an air pruning bed. Again, just remember, if you put them in an unprotected place, rodents may come and eat the seeds. So sow them thick if you're not putting them in a protected space. The other thing is, I oftentimes don't have a whole lot of bed space this time of year in the summer. I try to have all my beds growing by this point in the year. I don't save places for the plums. And so what I've moved to now is the same container, that bucket with the holes drilled in it that I'm using to clean my seed. I'm also using it for plum seed storage, where the seeds can sit there stratifying all summer long. In the fall, or whenever I have beds ready, typically in the fall, I can come through, I pour that container out, typically into a wheelbarrow or a larger container, and I just sort through by hand, plucking out all the seeds. This is where a screen can be helpful as well. I'm going to try this for the first time this fall, using a 1/2 inch hardware cloth as a screen to kind of collect some of the bigger, chunkier, woody bits, prevent them from falling through the screen. The plum seeds, the Chickasaw plum at least, should be small enough to fit through a 1/2 inch hardware cloth screen. Different, stone fruits have different size seeds. Obviously that wouldn't work for like peaches, but you could make a screen big enough to do what you need to do. Anyway, so that's how I'm collecting the seed out to sell them, is I'm plucking them out individually from the wood chips, but I can also pluck them out individually to sow them into beds. Or if I'm really just growing seeds for myself, I might just take that whole bucket and spread the whole thing over a bed and cover it with more wood chips. Plum seeds are about the size of a corn kernel. Corn can easily be planted 3 to 4 inches deep in the soil. And when it's planted 3 to 4 inches deep, corn comes up on its own just fine. So any seed that is roughly the size of corn or larger, my rule of thumb is they can be planted 3 to 4 inches deep in some combination of soil and mulch. Mulch is a little bit easier for them to poke through usually than soil. It doesn't weigh as much, but sometimes bigger chunky bits can be a problem. It depends on how finely, sorted and, screened your mulch is. But I mean, that's really all that there is to, the way that I plant plums. In the past, what I have done before, I used to not use this whole store them in a bucket method. I used to just get the plums, get the seeds out of the fruit using some combination of the methods we've talked about here. And I would build new air pruning beds every summer. Well, this is only going back the past few years. I would build new air pruning beds in the summer, fill them up with leaf compost and worm compost and everything that I typically grow trees in. That's a whole other topic, a whole other video on its own, soil mediums. Let me know if you have questions. We can certainly dive deeper into that. But fill up the bed with soil medium, sow the seeds on top, cover them up with mulch, water them in, walk away. Again, this is happening in summer within a few weeks of me collecting the seeds, sometimes they'll sit in the fridge for a few weeks while I'm kind of making time to actually make the beds, or the fruit might sit in the fridge for a week or so before I get around to processing it. It's okay if they're in cold storage for like a few weeks during the summer. It's not going to trick them into going into their double dormancy. I do feel that it's important to not let the seed fully dry out. I feel like sometimes that can be a trigger for the double dormancy. I'm not 100% sure what all the limiting factors or triggers are for double dormancy, but I think drying out can be one. So in the summer, there are droughts sometimes, right? And so the seed can get dry. You just don't want it to completely, totally bone dry out the way that you would, say dry squash seeds or tomato seeds for planting in your garden. You don't want them to get bone dry. And so if I plant them in a bed and I mulch them heavily and I water them in once or twice when I plant them, typically they're going to stay moist enough on their own throughout summer. If we have really extreme droughts, I'll water the bed, the place where I planted them in the summer. Or in this year's context, I will water the storage bucket that has the plum seed if we're in a really extreme drought. I don't want them to dry. You also don't want them to be too wet because seeds can mold. If things get too wet, they can mold. So moisture is always a balance. There's always a fine line between too much and too little water. But that's it, folks. That's all I do. I hope I laid it out there relatively concisely for you guys. If you have questions, let me know. If you have, I always love hearing how you guys do it. We don't always have to agree on things. It's interesting and valuable, I think, to hear perspectives that may be different to your perspective, right? That's what this is all about, sharing this here on the YouTube platform. I should mention again, I'm in zone 7B here where I'm at. I've done this in 7B and 8A for Chickasaw plums specifically. There's going to be certain limits depending on the plum species and how cold or how warm your climate is in terms of will they get enough chill hours stratifying outdoors, or will they get too much cold stratifying outdoors in your environment. I'm sure there is a limit of how cold the plum seed can get before they will die. Something I would love to hear feedback on if you guys have done this, I need to do some experiments here myself, is can plum seeds, Chickasaw plum or others, survive being in the freezer for a long period of time? Because a lot of plum and peach and just a lot of stone fruit growers will take their fruits, and if they're not selling them fresh, if they're going to be putting them into some sort of jam or preservative that they're going to sell, it's common practice to freeze the fruits whole as they come off the trees and slowly work through the walk-in freezer, pulling the fruits out, processing them. And for that sort of an operation, the pits are usually a waste stream item. It's not a super, because there can be toxins in the seeds at varying levels, they're not typically something that's fed to animals, at least as far as I'm aware. And so it's something that for us growers, it could be an easy and cheap way to get a lot of seed, but I don't know if plum seed, again, I don't know if stone fruits, how viable they are after they've been in the freezer. I'm sure somebody has played with this, and if not, we're going to try doing some experiments here, and I'll report back on how it goes. But I would love to hear if you've got experience on that. And then what I would expect is germination in the spring. That's what's worked for us the past few years, is in the spring, the seeds, like magic, they just come up on their own. The Chickasaw plums are pretty vigorous growers, we find. They're not super picky about soil, and I've got some. We're in middle of July right now. Some of the Chickasaw plums in the air pruning beds that I've got are over 2 feet tall, and the beds are planted really, really dense. As always, the rule is the denser you plant, the smaller the trees are going to be, but you'll have more of them. The more spacing you give each seed, the bigger the trees will be, but the fewer of them that you'll have. That's always kind of the rule with planting. And the seedlings can be pretty quick to get large, to get established. I've got some Chickasaw plum seedlings, a pair of them that I planted at the North Carolina site down there, Cedar Grove. And let's see, I'm trying to remember. They are in their 3rd year now. They grew as 1 year in an air pruning bed, and I transplanted them out in between 2 peaches. I just wasn't sure how long the peaches are going to be there. These are the purple-leafed, red-leaf peaches you may have seen in some of my other videos. There's 2 Chickasaw plums in between them that are seedlings. Going into their 3rd year, and they're almost as tall as I am. I mean, they're big. They're fast, vigorous growers. They're very drought hardy, drought tolerant, and just adaptable plants. They do really well here in the Southeast. This is where they want to be. They're well adapted to this environment. And at least in the, I don't have a ton of experience, but in my experience so far, seedling Chickasaw plums have grown way faster than sucker Chickasaw plums. The suckers have been slow to establish and a little bit stressed out every time that I plant them. Some do better than others. It's certainly a viable way to propagate them, but the seedlings always seem to have more vigor and speed taken off out of the gate compared to the suckers. So I always prefer to plant seedlings, but suckers is just so convenient. You know, you get suckers that come out anyway, and if you want to control, you know, at a certain point, the patch gets as big as you want it to be, you want to control it, you're just going to mow them down anyway. Why not dig them up and propagate the plant? It's easier. You don't need any skills really to copy the plant that way, whereas otherwise, if you wanted to copy the plant, you'd have to graft it, where you need skills, knowledge to be able to graft. So suckers, it's a really valid way to propagate the plant. Again, it's a useful tool. But in my opinion, seedlings way more vigorous, way more fun. It's interesting. You don't know what you're going to get. I really just like seedlings, but they're all tools in the toolbox. They're all appropriate to use. You got to decide what you want to do more of in your situation. I'm trying to think if there's any other things I want to share, tips for propagating plums. They typically like full sun. You could grow them with some shade. You know, I think as long as you get 6 hours of sun, you should be good. They're probably going to want well-draining soil. You know, all the places that I have seen Chickasaw plums have been kind of sandier soils, but they're adapted to the Southeast, and a lot of the Southeast is clay. So, and the places where I've established them, you know, the seedlings and the suckers, there's a sandy layer, you know, maybe like 6 inches at the most, and then a lot of clay, and they're doing very well at that site. So they're not, in my experience, they're not super picky about soil. The more, you know, nutrients you give them, the more biology, the more water that you provide, the more you optimize the growing medium, the faster they'll grow, the more vigorous they'll be, but typically they're not very picky. Anyway, folks, I appreciate you if you stayed along this long. If you clicked on this video and you want to learn more about Chickasaw plums beyond just propagation, if you want to learn what they are, where to find them, how to forage for them, check out our recent video picking Chickasaw plums down in North Carolina, specifically outside of Raleigh. We try to go over some of that, how we pick them, and just, you know, what they are, the habitats that they grow in, what they look like as they mature. I can't think of anything else that I want to include on this video, but like I said, grateful for you all. If you stayed along this long, I hope you learned something. Let me know if you've got other questions or comments. Like I said, I always love hearing how you guys are doing things related to the videos that I'm putting out. Thanks for stopping in. I'll catch you in the next one. All right, I did think of one thing I wanted to add, and that is a note on double dormancy. If you follow all of these steps or do something similar and try to germinate Chickasaw plum or other stone fruits, and spring comes around and your seed doesn't germinate, what do you do? Don't panic. First of all, do not panic. The first thing you're going to want to do is look around in your bed, in your pots, wherever you planted the seed, and make sure you can find the seeds. The first thing you're inspecting for is, did something else eat the seeds? Like a rodent, did a mold come in and eat the seeds? You want to just make sure that there's still seeds. If there's still seeds there, again, still don't panic. If the seeds are not there, then you got a problem, okay? Because they're, like I said, they're probably been eaten. But if the seeds are still there, typically that means that they're in double dormancy. And I think the reason it's called double is because typically to get them out of that dormancy, you need to get a second season, basically a second chance for them to have their stratification. So you need to have some sort of way to give them a warm season followed by a cool season. And typically that second spring, or I guess in a way now we're at the third spring, maybe saying third spring is a little bit misleading, but you collect the fruits in summer, you try to germinate them the following spring, they don't germinate, you're gonna have to probably wait an additional year to the following spring after that for the seeds to germinate. I have had this happen where I've had plum seeds, peach seeds basically germinate almost 2 years after I planted them. Not quite exactly 24 months, but close to it, like, you know, almost 20 months before the seeds germinate if they go into that double dormancy. And I think there's potential for them to be dormant even longer. I've definitely heard some reports of them really being dormant for a long time. So that's typically what I will do, my process, if I discover low germination or no germination on plum seeds. That's how I would approach it if you encounter that. Again, if you have any questions, let me know.